We're talking about an invasion of our country with drugs, with human traffickers, with all types of criminals and gangs. Last year, 70,000 Americans were killed, at least, I think the number is ridiculously low, by drugs, including meth and heroin and cocaine, fentanyl. We want to stop drugs from coming into our country. We want to stop criminals and gangs from coming into our country.
That's the President of the United States conflating and mixing up things in order to defend his position, explaining why he thought it was absolutely necessary to declare a national emergency to build a wall at the southern border. The president says the main threats are criminals and drugs coming across. For fact's sake, let us look at the reality on the ground. The president said this was, quote, an invasion of our country with all kinds of criminals. But less than 3% of immigrants stopped at the border, either entering illegally or through legal ports of entry. Less than 3% have a criminal history. That's according to Customs and Border data from October of 2017 to August of 2018. That is the Border and Customs under President Trump. The Trump administration's own National Drug Threat Assessment points out that while drug-related murders in Mexico continue to reach epidemic proportions, there is, quote, little spillover violence in the United States. This is the Drug Enforcement Agency in 2018. As far as President Trump claimed that the wall would stop drugs from coming into the country, well, according to the DEA's 2015 National Drug Threat Assessment, cartels, quote, transport the bulk of their drugs over the southern border through ports of entry. Big pieces of land that don't have a barrier, that might have a river, that might have a canyon, they're not actually the place where the bulk of the drugs come from. These are ports of entry. Ports of entry is a place you go up to and there's a human there who checks your truck or your car or asks you questions. Statistics from Customs and Border Protection show that in 2018, 90% of heroin, 88% of cocaine, 87% of meth, and 80% of fentanyl seized along the border was being smuggled in across legal ports of entry. Apparently, the president doesn't have access to these statistics. So if any of you have them, we'll post this. And can you please forward it to @RealDonaldTrump? Because these are his own government's statistics. However, we don't just depend on them. We depend on our own reporting. So joining me now, NBC News national security and justice reporter Julia Ainsley and NBC's Gadi Schwartz, live along the San Diego border. These are our people who dig into this stuff very, very specifically. Julia looks at all of the data that she can find, both official, anecdotal, and from third parties. Julia, let's start with you. Can you talk about the president's claim that a lot of these people crossing the border are dangerous criminals?
Yeah, Ali, I'd love to. And it's not just important today when he's making this case for the wall, but they will continue to use these statistics to justify a lot of policies we may see going forward against asylum seekers who are coming to the border. So on that claim, yes, less than 3%, I did the math, of people who came to the border during the latest time period, fiscal year 18, had a criminal history. But the far leading criminal charge of that less than 3% was illegal reentry. Those are people who were already deported and then they came back. So that is a felony under U.S. law, but it's certainly not a violent crime. Another piece of information is, according to Cato Institute, it's a libertarian think tank, they took crime data from Texas, because Texas is one of very few states that actually breaks out crimes by non-U.S. citizens versus U.S. citizens. And they found that per capita, U.S. citizens commit more crimes than non-U.S. citizens that are illegal or legally here in the United States. So that is something that the president was confronted with today, and he just completely dismissed. But that is not from...
He specifically said, I have different data than you have, and I trust my government's data. And he cited DHS data, but you and I have had very specifically this discussion. The last time you, Julie, and I talked about DHS data, it was actually misrepresented data about the number of possible terrorists coming over the border, where the president said, quoting DHS data, and Secretary Nielsen quoting it, said 3,755 on a particular list, and the real number was 6.
That's right. That was 6 in the first half of fiscal year 2018 on a database. And we were able to get that because that's the data that Customs and Border Protection provided Congress. So it's really not a matter of picking and choosing your data here, that the numbers speak for themselves, Ali. But if you notice, he did not mention terrorists coming across the southern border today. And he didn't mention it in his Oval Office address shortly after he broke that story. So I think they're starting to get away from the terrorist argument and focusing more on criminals and drugs. But again, you pointed out how important it is to realize that those drugs are not coming through anywhere that a wall would be able to block. They're coming through legal ports of entry. And just last month, Customs and Border Protection, with some people who have like PhDs and being able to detect, biochemicals and drugs coming through the border, they detect these things very quickly, very, very well. And one thing they found a record number, 254 pounds of fentanyl coming through in what looked like a truck full of cucumbers.
Yep.
So that's something that wasn't spoken about today either, because he doesn't want to focus on people catching them through their day-to-day job.
On the remarkable success, by the way, of Customs and Border Protection and the Border Patrol getting this stuff. It's actually pretty successful. Gadi, I just want to be very clear. We are not taking a position on the fact that there needs to be border security and a country needs to have border security. But on the issue of drugs, which you follow very closely, the president has said over and over again that the wall will stop the flow of drugs into the country. Now, there's no debate that there's some drugs that come over the southern border. Most of it, the vast majority of it, comes through ports of entry. Maybe some of it comes otherwise. But the fact is, of the 70,000 deaths from drugs that the president talks about, many of which are from heroin, fentanyl, and other opioids, they come in not just through ports of entry on the border, they come in through airports.
Yeah, so yesterday something happened that was really interesting. I haven't heard Border Patrol necessarily be open about this. Usually when you hear from Border Patrol, they're talking about those big drug seizures that we've heard about. But yesterday we were spending a little bit of time on the border with the Border Patrol chief here in the San Diego sector, and he didn't tell us about those stops. He told us about something that happened a few weeks ago where they found a cut in one of the old legacy walls, and they found tire tracks that led off into the desert. But his Border Patrol agents weren't able to get there in time, and so they don't know what crossed over into the United States. And he says that's what keeps him up at night, and that's what they're saying is a crisis. They're saying that what they're seeing on the Mexico side is a lot more family units, a lot more migrant caravans, and that is diverting the resources to processing some of these family units, keeping Border Patrol agents in things like hospitals. He said that there were about 40 different Border Patrol agents assigned to hospitals in the San Diego sector on any given day, and it's keeping them away from these desolate stretches of the desert where sometimes human smugglers and sometimes drugs do cross, even if there is some sort of wall there. So what they're saying is they want to see smart fencing installed, basically fencing that you see up here along the edge. It's fencing that has fiber optic cables. That's the type of fencing that they want installed. This stuff right here, they say that this isn't very effective. It's gotten to the point where you can cut through this in about a matter of a minute and a half. So they want that secondary fencing that you see over there stretching all the way through. And California is an interesting place because while the president was speaking, we were talking to people that were crossing the port of entry. We're at the San Ysidro port of entry. It's one of the busiest crossings in the world. And we asked them, is there a state of emergency here? The majority of them said it does not feel like there is a state of emergency. That's what we've heard along most of the California border. However, some of them said that worked over here in this store that it did feel like an emergency because this area was shut down several times because of those migrant caravans and skirmishes that happened just over here. Now, when we broke that down, there was a little bit of a disconnect because we started asking them about Beto O'Rourke's suggestion yesterday and his comments that he may be willing to see the border taken down in El Paso. When we asked people that live around here what they thought would happen when the fence would come down in San Diego, they said overwhelmingly, out of 27 people, 25 of them, only 2 people said the opposite, but 25 of them said that it would be chaos, that it would be a disaster, and that we would see a flood of people crossing the border like they saw in the 1990s and 2000s. So a lot of people saying there is no emergency, but a lot of people also pointing to these fences that have been up in California for well over a decade.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos. here. To watch the latest interviews and highlights, you can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.